Story 1. Deep strikes. Ukrainian long-range strikes on Russia are getting harder to describe as just a series of dramatic raids. More and more, this looks like a systematic campaign, where what matters is not only the fire at one specific site, but the new reality taking shape for the Russian rear itself. If in 2024 these attacks still looked more like exceptions, then by 2025 and 26 Ukraine had begun hitting targets regularly at distances of hundreds and more than 1,000 kilometers, forcing Russia to protect not only the front line, but the depth behind it. In the first weeks of March, the strikes hit exactly the nodes this war depends on: the port of Novorossiysk, with its oil infrastructure and likely damaged ships, the Taman substation, linked to the energy bridge to Crimea, and Crimea's military infrastructure itself, from the aircraft repair plant in Yeupatoria to the Sivash platform, which Russia used for reconnaissance, communications, electronic warfare, and directing strikes on southern Ukraine. A separate line is energy and fuel. In Crimea, after air raid alerts, electricity and water went out. In Krasnodar Krai, substations and oil facilities were burning. Later, the oil depot in Tikhoretsk, the port of Kavkaz, and the Afipsky refinery also caught fire. This is no longer about isolated hits. It is about trying to break entire supply chains, where one hit can strike several links in the system at once. Another line is military and defense industrial infrastructure. Chemical plants in Kirovo-Chapetsk, Veliki Novgorod, Tolyatti, and Gabaka came under attack. And in Bryansk, not drones but Storm Shadow missiles hit the Kremny L plant, which produces microelectronics for Russian missiles, air defense, and drones. That is an important shift. Ukraine is hitting more and more not only the arrows, but the archer. At sea and in Crimea, the effect is just as telling. The sanctioned gas tanker Arctic Metegas was burning. In Novorossiysk and near the port of Kavkaz, ships and logistics infrastructure were damaged. In Crimea, panzer systems, boats, air defense elements, depots, and even an Iskander prepared for launch were destroyed. The deeper and more precise these strikes get, the more costly the illusion of a safe rear becomes for Russia. Even where the direct physical effect is limited, the strategic result is already visible. According to the OSINT statistics collected in the material, more than half of the attacks at distances above 900 kilometers ended with successful hits on targets. And after 3 strikes on Alabuga, satellite imagery showed 11 Panzer S-1 positions on its territory. In other words, Ukraine is not just setting things on fire. It is forcing Russia to stretch its air defenses, plug holes, and pull resources from other directions. That is why deep strike is not about a pretty map with flight range on it. It is about the slow strangling of the war machine along its entire length. Russia can still launch missiles at Ukrainian cities, but it is doing a worse and worse job of protecting the factories, ports, energy sites, and logistics chains those missiles come from in the first place. Story 2. Middle strikes. Medium-range strikes look less dramatic than raids 1,000 kilometers deep into Russia, but more and more often they are the ones changing the front not on maps, but in the real mechanics of war. The point of middle strike is that Ukrainian drones and other strike systems break the enemy's rear area stability at a depth of 50 to 200 kilometers, in the zone where the Russian army used to have a space of relative safety. At the beginning of March, that was visible literally in the target list. Near Mariupol, Ukrainian forces destroyed a rare Ambir radar and a transporter loader vehicle for the S-300V system. They also hit a second radar, ammunition depots, equipment, a fuel depot, repair units, and troop concentrations in occupied parts of Donbas, Crimea, and Zaporizhia region. Every such loss is not just one target gone. It is one more blind spot and one more break in logistics. Then comes the most important effect, the one that is not always visible on video. According to Ukrainian military officials and analysts, on the Pokrovsk and Dobropilya directions, strikes on the rear have made normal movement of heavy equipment and transport almost impossible for the Russians already at 10 to 15 kilometers from the line of contact. Where regular resupply used to move, it has become a constant kill zone. Because of that, the Russian army is more and more often switching to motorcycles, ATVs, and small groups, trying to slip through the space where columns used to move. On maps, this can sometimes look like slow movement or strange gray zones. But the real point is different. Ukraine is burning out not the front line itself, but the very ability to reach it confidently with men, fuel, ammunition, and armor. The same effect is visible in the Zaporizhzhia direction. According to independent analysts, Russia was trying to solve two operational tasks at once there, but Ukrainian counterattacks and pressure on the rear sharply cut the pace of advance. In some sectors, they reduced it to zero and even forced Russian troops to pull back. In other words, Middle Strike does not promise a miraculous collapse of the front overnight, but it does make the Russian offensive more and more expensive, slower, and harder to organize. Even Russian pro-war voices have begun to admit the problem. Russian military bloggers are openly talking about a local Ukrainian advantage in FPV strikes on the Russian rear at depths of up to 100 kilometers, and they explain it with Ukrainian technology, the vulnerability of Russian infrastructure, air defense problems, and corruption in the leadership. When this is being admitted not in Kyiv but from the Russian side, the argument is no longer about the assessment. It is about reality. That is why Middle Strike is not a story about separate lucky hits. It is about the disappearance of the safe battalion rear as a real concept. Ukraine is trying to win not a competition in massive men and shells, but a struggle for space in which Russia formally holds positions, yet is less and less able to supply them, reinforce them, and use them safely. Story 3, Center 795. After the failure of the old project, Unit 29155 of Russian military intelligence, which was associated with assassinations abroad, Russia apparently did not abandon political killings and kidnappings. It simply repackaged them in a more modern and more secretive structure. That is how the investigation by the Insider and Der Spiegel describes Center 795, a super-secret structure created in late 2022 for sabotage, murders, kidnappings abroad, and operations against Ukraine. The new center was set up not as a normal military unit, but as a hybrid of the security services, the military, and a corporation. It was established as a top-secret and fully autonomous entity with direct subordination to General of the Army Valery Gerasimov. Its base was placed in Patriot Park, military patriotic recreation park near Moscow. Its people were put on salary through the Kalashnikov corporate group. And the training and organizational infrastructure was hidden under a corporate cover. In other words, state violence was not pushed into the shadows. It was simply given a more convenient cover. According to the investigation, the center has around 500 employees, divided into intelligence, assault, and support branches. On paper, it looks almost like an elite autonomous machine for special operations, complete with heavy weapons, UAVs, radio intelligence, and an agent network. It was headed by Denis Fienko, a man whose background spans both the Alpha Group Special Purpose Center and the management of special projects at the Kalashnikov concern. But the real value of this story is not in the structure's name or its size. It is in how it surfaced. According to the investigation, one of the center's operatives was Denis Alamov, a former employee of the Stavropol branch of the National Guard and the Alpha Security Service, who was arrested on February 24, 2026, at the main airport in Bogota, Colombia, at the request of the United States. U.S. materials say he was preparing an operation against relatives of the Chechen emigre Ahmed Zakayev, and, through an intermediary, local operative Darko Durovic, of Serbo-Croatian origin, discussed kidnappings for money, up to $1.5 million for one target and up to $10 million for a third person who was to be delivered dead or alive. And what is especially telling here is not only the accusation itself, but how it all came out. Investigators were able to reconstruct the details of the operation because of the most banal mistake. The people involved used Google Translate to translate messages between Russian and Serbo-Croatian, and after a court order, the FBI obtained the translation logs. As a result, FBI agents were able to read the clear text content of the entire operational communications thread in real time. In other words, an expensive machine of external violence tripped not over brilliant enemy counterintelligence, but over its own idiocy. That is probably the core of the whole story. After previously failed and defunct military unit 29155, Russia tried to build a more disciplined, more intelligent, and more autonomous structure for covert war. But in the end it produced the same familiar mix of overconfidence, incompetence, and nobody being responsible. So the story of Center 795 is not just another spy plot. It is a concentrated version of the Russian system itself, a state waging an aggressive war against Ukraine, while at the same time building infrastructure for transnational kidnappings and killings, and then still exposing itself through cheap tradecraft and machine translation. In brief, the other major developments. Ukraine is sending its first group of experts to the Middle East to help Gulf countries counter Iranian drones. This is no longer just about importing experience, but exporting Ukrainian military expertise. Russia keeps striking Ukrainian cities. At night, Sumy region, Dnipropetrovsk region, and Zaporizhia were attacked, with people and civilian infrastructure hit, from private homes to transport and businesses. In the Zaporizhia direction, Russia is still trying to advance with the Dnipro grouping, but over the last month the pace of advance has dropped sharply, and in some places Russian units were forced to fall back altogether. In the Dobropilya direction, according to the researcher Play Fra and Ukrainian military sources, things have grown noticeably quieter, not least because of strikes on the Russian rear. Some Russian troops simply cannot reach the front line reliably. That is also why the front line is getting more blurred in some sectors. Large gray zones are not a map error, but a sign that the space between the rear and the front has become a zone of constant instability and hunting. Even Russian pro-war commentators admit that Ukraine has gained a local advantage in FPV strikes on the Russian rear at depths of up to 100 kilometers. Their explanations already sound familiar: Ukrainian technology, holes in air defense, compromised infrastructure, and Russian corruption. On another line of pressure, the hunt for Russia's shadow fleet continues. In Sweden, authorities detained the captain of the vessel Kaffa on suspicion of using fake maritime certificates, and this is exactly the kind of case where a strike on gray logistics hits military income no worse than one precise strike. And while Ukraine is dismantling Russian logistics and exporting its experience in countering drones, Russia is sticking to its old specialty, hitting residential neighborhoods. In Zaporizhia, a Russian guided bomb struck a residential area. 2 people were killed and 22 were wounded, including a 17-year-old teenager. Thanks for watching. Sources and links are in the description. If you'd like to support the channel, the links are below. See you next week.